This podcast is brought to you by the Center for Law and Society at the University of Cape Town. This recording is part of a series of seminars entitled #Thought Leader Encounter, featuring leading and emerging academics on law and society in Africa. If you'd like to find out more about the work of the Center, check our website at www.cls.uct.ac.za or follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at CLSUCT. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Popo and Sally. I have abused my privileges with them, I think, a number of times. Firstly, because the idea for this topic started when I did an interview with them for the South African Crime Quarterly, which came out in June of this year. There's copies outside my office if you're interested, or you can ask someone from CLS, where we talked about the recent judgment and what that meant for changes in the field of practice around family joining. And so, having had a really fascinating conversation and feeling like there was much more to discuss, I used the opportunity to press my advantage and ask them if they would be willing to do a without law for us. And so they very kindly agreed, and I'm very thankful to both of them for having done so. Popo tells me they've agreed to introduce themselves, which suits me fine, because personally I hate being introduced by other people. I find someone reading, some summary of my CV off of a website just really cringeworthy. So that's fantastic. But thank you both very much for being here, and we're looking forward to a great hour.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just before I start, I just wanted to ask, does anyone know who a refugee is? What qualifies a person to be a refugee in South Africa? And the person giving the answer can't be a refugee themselves, because I recognize a couple of them in the audience.
Can you read
No one from UNHCR, because that would be cheating. Sir, in the nice denim jacket, do you know what a refugee is, or who a refugee is?
I think it's someone who's not born in the country.
So anyone not born in South Africa but comes to South Africa? Can anyone else try? Yes. Yes?
Someone who's fleeing from persecution.
Perfect. That's one leg of the definition. Perfect. Okay. We will use these terms interchangeably quite a lot during our presentation, so it's good that we do a very quick introduction about what an asylum seeker is and what a refugee is. So basically, an asylum seeker is a person who has come to South Africa to seek asylum. Right? They're in the process of seeking asylum. Their claim for asylum hasn't been adjudicated yet by the Department of Home Affairs. And a person who is a refugee, referred to as a formal refugee, is someone who has been recognized as a refugee. It means that Home Affairs has interviewed them, and based upon these two separate grounds, they've come to a conclusion that there is someone who's left their country because of persecution based on one of the listed grounds, or there's someone who's fled their country because of the events that is during the war is an example of one of them. Okay. So if you look at the numbers, I always like to say there's two very important challenges that are facing humankind. The first one is climate change, and the next is forced migration. The number of people who require international protection has not been improving, has not been going down over the years, it has been getting worse. 70 million people are requiring international protection. And if you look at those numbers and you distill them within a regional perspective, you will realize that countries that are the most impoverished, or that have the least resources, many of which are in Africa, actually host the largest numbers of refugees. there's an unequal or an unfair distribution of refugees across the continent. And what is often referred to as what's called the accident of geography is that if you are closest to the problem, you will host the largest numbers of refugees. And part of the challenge there is that there isn't a system of distributing or sharing that responsibility or burden of refugees amongst those countries that are furthest away from the problem. Okay. What has South Africa done? Well, we are both a party to the 1951 Convention and its protocol, as well as the 1969 Convention. I'm not going to go into too much detail about what that means, but in a nutshell for your purposes, it means that we have incorporated both definitions of what a refugee or who a refugee is, both in the 1951 Convention and the 1969 Convention. And that's quite important. It's important because ultimately what has happened when we enacted our Refugees Act, our law that domesticates our obligations, is that our Refugees Act is hailed by many jurisdictions across the world as, on paper, being one of the best refugee protection frameworks in the world, the most liberal, the most progressive, because we not only protect people who flee persecution on one of the listed grounds, but we also provide protection to those who are fleeing war in their countries. Right? And furthermore, many other jurisdictions don't have free movement. So refugees or asylum seekers in South Africa are allowed to move freely about in South Africa without any restriction. But in many countries there are camps. They are restricted to camps. People may spend 5 to 10, 15 years sometimes sitting in a camp, unable to integrate into society. And also what's very important with our Refugees Act is that we allow asylum seekers and refugees to access socio-economic rights, the right to work, right, the right to, well, on paper, the right to access healthcare. And those that are recognized as refugees can even access social security grants. So in essence, the only thing a refugee can't do, or an asylum seeker can't do in South Africa, is vote. That's how liberal or progressive our system is. However, the problem lies in the application of the refugee system. There's a huge disjuncture between what the liberal law says and how refugees are actually treated as they enter the asylum system. So these are some of the more worrying and depressing problems. The first is simple thing like access to the system. So someone coming to South Africa for the first time wanting to apply for asylum must go to a Home Affairs office that is designated as a refugee reception office. They must lodge an application. Once they lodge an application, they'll be issued with a Section 22 permit. It's an asylum seeker permit. It's got their face, it's got their date of birth, and it's got an expiry date on it. It allows them to access socioeconomic rights, allows them to open a bank account, allows them to work while their application is being adjudicated. This is before someone is able to actually interview them and determine, do you qualify for refugee status or not? Simply getting into the office is a challenge. You'd be surprised and shocked to find out that of the few refugee reception offices that we have that are still in operation, people sometimes camp outside the office since 3 a.m. in the morning, and many a time will stand in the line until 4 o'clock when the office closes without being seen. And they will go for a whole week with that happening, without being able to get into an office, just simply lodge an application. And for most of us who complain sometimes of having to stand in a very short queue to apply for an ID, it's 100 times more difficult for people to get into the office. Part of that challenge is because for some reason the Department of Home Affairs made a decision a few years back to close the Cape Town Refugee Reception Office as well as the Port Elizabeth office. Both of those decisions were challenged and they lost. The Cape Town office was ordered by the Supreme Court of Appeal to open last year in March, still not open. The Port Elizabeth office was ordered by the Supreme Court of Appeal to open by, I think by 2018 or 2016 if I'm not mistaken, 2015. It only opened last year in October. Yes, it only opened last year in October. So access is a huge problem. The other one is that there's selective assistance. If you don't have a 20 Rand or 50 Rand to give or to grease the palms of the security guard who lets you into the office, you may stand there for a whole week without being able to get into the office. Right? And the delays in adjudication is probably one of the biggest problems in the system. The law says, very liberal law says, once you lodge an application, that application must be finalized within 6 months. There are people who've been here since 2000 who've made applications and their applications have not been finalized. That's like writing an exam and waiting 15 years to find out what the decision is. And part of what causes those delays in adjudication is, the depressing thing is that there is a top-down, unspoken rule within Home Affairs that it doesn't matter how good the merits of your application is, right? you may be a young man from the eastern part of DRC who is at risk of being forcibly conscripted into one of the many different militias that are operating within the eastern DRC. Or you may be a young man who's fled parts of Somalia where the Al-Shabaab is quite active. And you come to South Africa and make an application. Your application will be rejected. At the first instance, they've got a 99.9% rejection rate. And this is irrespective of how good your merits are. And then what happens is that these applications then bottleneck with the appeal or review bodies. The Refugee Appeal Board, who's meant to review or who's meant to listen to appeals, has a backlog of 300,000 applications. And they can hear roughly about 120 appeals a year. It will take them about 4,000 years to finalize the backlog. And that backlog was numbers that were given to us in 2018. What we do know is that this number has gone up. Right? So, what's problematic is that we've got an amazing refugee protection system, but however, Home Affairs or our state has taken the position that they're going to make it, in my opinion, as difficult as they possibly can for people to get into the system, to remain in the system, and to finally get refugee status, that they're hoping people are just going to give up. And some people do give up. So if you look at the number of people who've lodged applications and on their system appears to have abandoned applications, that number is quite high. Because people, A, can't even get into the office to renew their permit, right? Or if they can get into the office to renew their permit, someone asks them for a bribe. Or when they've given a version of their story which is honest and truthful, which would qualify for them for refugee status, they are rejected nonetheless. And this causes huge problems because we have what the world would view as an amazing refugee protection system on paper, but the people who are meant to have access to that system are not treated with the requisite respect and decency that they deserve. Okay. The theme for many of the CLS conferences and workshops that I've attended is that ultimately what matters is that the law, irrespective of how sometimes it's not implemented as well, it matters. At least having a framework that is in place matters, because there are many jurisdictions that don't have a refugee protection framework, right? That doesn't spell out exactly what the rights and responsibilities the state has towards refugees. So having the law exists, and we as civil society activists and lawyers working in this space have been able to use the law to fight for the rights of refugees and to defend refugees in instances where we feel that the state is narrowing the space, which is always not easy. And I think part of Sally's presentation is going to be showing you that if you go through all of those hurdles of finally getting that permit, what are the challenges in being able to access those socio-economic rights that are due to you that this document alleges that you're entitled to? So having law that is liberal and progressive has allowed us to slowly and gradually develop refugee protection in South Africa, despite all of the challenges, because refugee law is something that is fairly popular in South Africa, even though we enacted the Act in 1998, but the content and scope of rights, how far do rights extend, is something that civil society has slowly and deliberately developed through our jurisprudence and through our courts. But the difficult part there is that our courts are starting to show strain, because a lot of these matters, the courts are being more and more being pulled into this very political and polycentric space, which makes them uncomfortable, where they have to make these far-reaching judgments around the content and scope of these rights. So far it has been good because the law exists, but we're now moving in a very, very terrible direction. So Home Affairs has realized, okay, these cheeky smart lawyers are using this very liberal law to uphold and to protect the rights that exist anyways, because we don't implement the law correctly. So what they've simply done is that since 2008, they've started to introduce some very terrible amendments to the Refugees Act, which aim to erode at the content and scope of the rights. I think that discussion is probably well beyond the scope of this presentation, but if it does come up during our discussion phase, I'm more than happy to take you through what some of those amendments are. One of them, most worryingly, is the automatic right to work. So Home Affairs intends to take that right away without any kind of clear policy as to how they're going to take care of asylum seekers and refugees if you take away their right to work. They want to have it on a case-by-case basis where they allow them the freedom to work. So if people can't work, it means they can't be self-sufficient, right? So you then have to have the budget to look after all of their needs. It makes completely no sense. And also they've come up with this idea that they want to build asylum processing centers, which in essence we believe are going to be detention centers, which are closer to the border. So people won't be allowed to leave unless they get special permission to leave. If you house people, you're going to have to look after them. The free movement protocol, or the free movement aspect of our refugee protection system would make sense, because if you allow people to move freely throughout society, they can integrate and they can be self-sufficient. And I think part of the thinking that we've heard from Home Affairs is that, well, it's for their own good. It's to protect them. It's to ensure that their needs are provided for. But in our experience, and many studies have shown, that asylum seekers and refugees are actually self-sufficient. Many of them are employ South African citizens, and many of them run their own businesses. So this whole idea that the view or the idea of an asylum seeker or refugee is someone who has their hands out like this is completely incorrect. So the law matters. It's not implemented as well as it should be, but at least there is a floor, a bottom minimum that we can use to advocate for the rights of asylum seekers and refugees. I hope I haven't depressed you too much. There is hope. There are many of us working in this space because it's important for us to be a country that affords people who are seeking asylum, especially in light of our own history where many of our freedom fighters found refuge in many other African countries and were welcomed with open arms. Now when it is our time to do so, it seems as though we are trying to narrow and close down the refugee space, which to us doesn't make sense. But Home Affairs is of the opinion that we're being overrun. Our borders are being overrun by asylum seekers and refugees, which is completely incorrect. The African Center for Migration Studies did a study of the total number of asylum seekers and refugees and migrants in generally in South Africa. And by their survey and their best estimates, they estimate that asylum seekers and refugees and general migrants make up only between 3 and 5% of our entire population. It's a tiny number, which has a very little significance or impact on access to socio-economic rights of other South African citizens. Where the challenge then is that certain asylum seekers and refugees and other general migrants are concentrated in certain parts of the country. Johannesburg is one of them, which makes it appear that we're being overrun. But the numbers simply don't support the position that South Africa is moving in. We don't understand what has informed this new shift, this new paradigm in narrowing and restricting the scope of refugee protection. I'll pause there for now. Thank you.
I don't think Popo actually introduced himself, but I'm sure that most people know him as an attorney at UCT's Refugee Rights Unit. And my name is Sally Gandar. I'm from Scalabrini Centre, Cape Town. We're an NGO that assists migrants, asylum seekers and refugees here in Cape Town. We're really grateful to people like Popo and UCT because they help us to litigate cases. I'd like to start South Africa had an amazing researcher who lived here for a number of years, and she's since left the country. And she's just recently written a new academic paper. And I just want to start with something that she says. And it's a description. Outside of a migrant processing area, individuals and families with small children, some of them babies, have set up a makeshift camp. Individuals weaved among sleeping babies, stepping over a Peppa Pig lunchbox, a Mona colouring book, and dwindling stacks of bread and diapers. Fathers doled out powdered milk mixed with water in bottles to whining toddlers. Mothers strung up underwear on the cyclone fence sides. Left to fend for themselves, these men, women, and children live and sleep outside for days or even weeks as they wait for the chance to apply for asylum. While asylum seekers sleeping outside of refugee reception offices is a familiar scene in South Africa, the account above describes the situation at the US border crossing. I think that most of us have probably seen on the news what's happening in the US, but we don't necessarily know what's happening down the road in the CBD at the foreshore. And if you drive there early enough in the morning, or if you pass by, you'll see the queues of people there. This picture that has just been painted through that quote, and it's from Ronnie Ahmed, who used to be with the African Center for Migration and Society and is now in Long Island. It's it's a picture that we do associate with refugees, and I just want to be clear from the outset that while I'm going to paint a negative picture in my presentation, one of the things that I have seen time and again in the work that I do on a daily basis with asylum seekers and refugees is resilience. And so I don't want to say that refugees are only vulnerable, but that actually they are some of the most resilient people that you will meet. And I'd like that to be taken away more than the vulnerability. So Popo, thank you for your presentation. I want to just give a couple of numbers as well, and these are from the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee. In 2009, the Department of Home Affairs processed 157,204 applications, and that's first instance adjudication. So it's that initial getting an asylum seeker permit. It's not being eventually recognized as an asylum seeker. So roughly just under 160,000 for the year. Fast forward to almost 10 years later, in 2018, the South African Department of Home Affairs processed 18,104 applications. Numbers matter, and those are numbers that are given to Parliament, and so they're useful just in terms of framing what Popo was saying about these pictures that we get in the media of South Africa allegedly being overrun by asylum seekers, which is really not the case. But let's move on to socioeconomic rights for migrants and asylum seekers. So Popo mentioned that South Africa takes an integrated approach. And what that means is that we don't have refugee camps. We want asylum seekers, or initially when our legislation was framed, it was framed in terms of the constitutional rights and freedoms, including the freedom of movement, including access to health and social services. And the integration approach is one that seeks to ensure that refugees are able to live meaningful lives and make meaningful contributions to their host country while being afforded protection by that host country. For asylum seekers, so those people who have not yet been recognized as refugees, they have access to our Bill of Rights. Refugees also have access. And I would put you on the spot like Popo did in terms of definitions. If anyone knows where or how someone has access to those rights, can you put up your hand? And I forgive you if you don't. No one? Maybe James, but that's cheating, James. Okay, so the Bill of Rights in Section 7 enshrines the rights that are in that Bill of Rights to everyone. Okay, and if you go through the various rights in the Bill of Rights, some of them say everyone. The right to vote says citizens. So you can see which rights are given to all persons in the country, regardless of their nationality. For refugees, it's not only through Section 7, but also through Section 27 of the Refugees Act, which reaffirms that persons recognized as persons in need of protection, so refugees, have access to all the rights in Chapter 2 of our Constitution. And there was also a court case about this. I've framed my talk kind of linking it to cases because we're on the law campus, but if they're useful, then please write them down, but if not, sorry for being overly legal. So Tantush, which is Tantoush versus the Refugee Appeals Board, said, within our constitutional dispensation, the Bill of Rights is applicable equally to foreigners and hence asylum seekers, as it is to citizens. So access to all the rights in the Bill of Rights that are given to everyone is available to asylum seekers and to refugees. But let's look at what that really means, right? So we've got the right to work. Once you're recognized, you'd be able to go and seek employment. If you have an asylum permit, you're also able to seek employment. That wasn't always the case. It was a hard-won right through the case of Wachanuka. And Mrs. Wachanuka was from Zimbabwe. She had a child who I believe was a person with disabilities. And she was in the asylum kind of queue, as it were, waiting for her asylum application to be processed. And back then, it wasn't clear whether you could work or study as an asylum seeker. It was a decision that was the Standing Committee for Refugees had to make for applications. And her case was taken on and it was litigated. And what the court said, I think, is really beautiful. And I'm just going to find my quote here. Sorry about this. Okay. The judgment states, "The inherent dignity of all people is one of the foundational values of the Bill of Rights. It constitutes the basis and the inspiration for the recognition that is given to other more specific protections that are afforded by the Bill of Rights. The freedom to engage in productive work, even where that is not required in order to survive, is an important component of human dignity, for mankind is preeminently a social species with an instinct for meaningful association." The reason that I love that quote is because it recognizes that being a productive member of society is something that is intrinsic to all of us as human beings, whether you have fed your country or not. And so work is not just about surviving. Now, one of the practical barriers that we see in the asylum system, I'm going to come here because it feels like you're all very far away, is so we've got these Section 22 permits that Popo spoke about. And does anyone here know how long they're renewed for? I think you must know this, but...
Like 1, 3, or 6 months?
Yes. Okay. So 1, 3, or 6 months. That means that, and Popo mentioned the refugee reception offices. There's one in Musina, there's one in Pretoria, there's one in Durban, there's one in PE, and there's the shell of one here in Cape Town. Okay, but in order to continue to renew your permit, you would have to either travel or you can renew at one of those offices for those time periods that Elizabeth mentioned. So if you're someone that is having to renew for every month, it would mean having to take time off work every month. It means having to explain to your employer. So you have to try and explain the system that is irrational to an employer. Ask for the leave time and then go every month and stand in a queue from realistically 4 in the morning until you are allowed to renew your asylum permits. Sometimes, as Popo also mentioned, you're not guaranteed that you'll get that renewal on that day, which means you have to go back the next day. And that's the limbo that you are stuck in for, and Popo mentioned this, 7+ years. So that's one of the practical barriers to being able to recognize or actually enjoy the right to work as an asylum seeker in South Africa. For refugees, perhaps it's a bit easier. A refugee certificate, which is issued in terms of Section 24, is usually valid for 4 years at a time. So you would have to take less time off work. However, and I have some redacted copies of both of these documents that people can come and look at after this lecture in case you're interested. The Section 22 permit is now endorsed with a specific right or ability, right to work and study in South Africa. So as an employer, if an asylum seeker came to me and was seeking employment, I could look at that document and it states that they can work and study. So that's a positive, but we've already heard the negatives. For the refugee certificate holder, it doesn't explicitly state on that certificate that they have the right to work and study. And so that is a potential barrier because as an employer you don't necessarily know all the different types of documentation that Home Affairs issues. So those are some of the practical barriers, and the brief that we were given just was to look at what the law says and then what the reality is. So that's on the right to work. But if we extend past just that ability to access work, and we look at other types of benefits. So linked to the right to work is the right, if you're unemployed, to get UIF benefits, subject to the requirements by the Department of Labour, so you'd have to comply with all of those. But so any employer has to pay UIF for anyone who they employ. But can an asylum seeker or refugee claim those benefits when they become unemployed? Because South Africans can. The second is it's labour rights more generally. So if you were to approach the CCMA, would you be able to access your rights at the CCMA simply with your asylum documentation? And so I've got some experiences to give you on these. So for those who do study labour law, the case of Discovery Health versus CCMA recognized that an employee isn't just someone who is in the country legally. So employment rights are afforded to everyone. But I want to say that that's on paper. It's far more difficult to actually access those rights in reality, particularly because it involves physically going into a building where you might be scared because you don't have valid documentation. Okay, and then just on accessing UIF, there was a recent court order this year. So a practice developed within the Department of Labour where asylum seekers were not able to claim their UIF benefits. So every month, if you're employed, your UIF gets deducted from your salary. And employers have to implement that. And so a number of asylum seekers tried to claim their UIF benefits at the Department of Labour and were unsuccessful. And a case, well, the court order basically said that what the Department of Labour has to do is it has to recognise that an asylum permit is a legitimate form of identification in South Africa. And that's quite important because that was February this year. But in 2010, in the matter of Consortium of Refugees and Migrants in South Africa versus Absa Bank, there was an issue with that document being accepted as a valid form of identification. And that was where asylum seekers had tried to open bank accounts, and they weren't able to. So Home Affairs' own document is not accepted as a valid form of identification by other institutions. And we sometimes hear, and we try and get it in writing when we do hear, that officials from Home Affairs inform those departments not to accept that document. So those are some barriers just in terms of labour rights and employment rights. There are other barriers, and I've got some infographics here that you're welcome to come and take afterwards. So there's the right to education. If you don't have a valid form of identification or a form of identification that is not necessarily recognized as such, then it's far more difficult for you to register your child at schools. So there's an incredible barrier there for asylum seekers and refugees. If you're born in South Africa, are you a citizen? Does anyone know? I know that if you're born in the US, for example, then you're a US citizen. But in South Africa, yes. No, that's correct. Okay, so people live their lives. They stand in queues, physical queues. They exist in paper queues for 7 to 10 to more years. And that does mean that while you're an asylum seeker, you may start a family here. You may want to get married, either to a South African or to someone from your home country or someone else. And you have children. Your children are born here. They're supposed to get a birth certificate. They don't. So what Home Affairs does, and is doing, is if they do, sometimes they issue a type of birth certificate, but it's handwritten, it's not printed. and it doesn't have an identity number on it. And without that identity number, you cannot register on the school system, which is now a computerized system in the Western Cape. It's also computerized in Gauteng. So that becomes a barrier for people trying to access education. So birth registration, but then the type or format of the birth registration. And it's not just people from outside of South Africa who are struggling to register births. There was a recent case in the High Court in the Eastern Cape where South African citizens didn't have birth certificates and so were denied access to schooling because of that. So there's birth registration, and then the last one that I want to talk about today, and it's something that is becoming a bigger conversation because of recent legislative proposals, is accessing healthcare. How many people in this room have been to a public hospital? Okay. A public hospital here in the Western Cape? Okay, so then you should know that there's like a two-tier system within the public hospitals here, right? Maybe? Okay, so there's city clinics and there's the provincial clinics. I only learned about this recently, and it's quite confusing to figure out which one you need to go to. The same applies in terms of like when you walk into a public hospital. Sometimes you are asked for your identity document, your proof of address, etc., etc. Now, if you go to what the law says, they should trust just your spoken word, but they don't, or they do if you're South African. I recently was at Refugee, and it was fine for me, but that's because I exist in a system of privilege, which allows me to access those services. Whereas for an asylum seeker with this form of identification that is not necessarily recognized, it is incredibly difficult. And then there are more barriers in terms of having to overcome types of medical xenophobia that exist. I'm not going to talk too much on healthcare access because one of the experts is over here. So Elizabeth is from MSF, and she's a wonderful resource on both healthcare access at hospitals, but also the impact of our prolonged asylum system in terms of mental health. If you exist for more than 7 years in a state of limbo, that has a huge impact on your mental and psychological health. And that then has impacts on your physical health. So I'm going to stop there so that we can have a conversation about barriers. Please use both Popo and I as resources, and let's just try and talk. We'll try and answer questions.
If you have a question, just put your hand up and we'll come round to the microphone.
Questions or just comments to say?
Are you able to?
Thank you for all this brief you gave to us. It's incredible, and again, Scalabrini and the UCT should be doing a great job in terms of helping the refugees. Sorry, my name is James Pondo. I am from Canadian Refugees Community. I represent the Rwandan refugees community living in Cape Town as well. So as a refugee, I know all these things you've explained to us. It will never be easy, but as you said, it will have to be decided. sometimes I always explain to people, ask me why I'm here or why I do what I do. Look, quite frankly, I always say to them that as long as I'm still alive, physically able, I will try my best to live. And that applies to anyone. I mean, what can stop you? What can stop you from doing this and that so that you live peaceful? So that's the reason why I'm here. Yeah, that was my introduction. My question is, currently we are having a huge problems, which I can call it the loss of our right to ownership. Let's say for any refugees who simply own a car, it's becoming difficult for us to renew our disc license. And it's crazy what the car has to do with me. You know, if I am driving my car, the law requires me to renew its disc on a yearly basis. And we are getting a huge problem. We cannot renew our disc. And this is causing another huge gap in the traffic department system. If you can see what is happening outside there, it's crazy. I can't tell you what's happening. People are, as I was saying, people are trying everything they can do to keep their wheels running on the road. And at the end of the day, it's illegal. But you cannot know, but it's illegal. Because someone owns the car that he or she bought last year, and he or she is not allowed to renew the license. But what can you do? So they are doing a lot of things to keep that wheel turning, and it's illegal if I put it that way. And I'm sure somehow, maybe after 5 years around the line, it will come out and we start to blame people. But what can they do?
Can I respond to that very quickly? James, we're aware of that issue, and I'm going to ask you to please see Nandi afterwards, because it is something that both Scalabrini and UCT are tracking, and we do know about it, and we've tried to have meetings with the traffic department already, but we want to hear about your experience so that we can try and develop. So please speak to Nandi, just so that we can at least get your details, because we are trying to find a solution to that.
And just to add, we're as baffled and as confused as members of the refugee community are in this regard, because the document you have is issued by the Department of Home Affairs, but the Department of Traffic says, well, it's not an actual proper figure document. Then what is it? Because if you get stopped without it, they're going to detain you. So it just makes no sense why they would suddenly now say they're not going to accept this document. It makes zero sense whatsoever. But Sally's correctly pointed out, it's something that, if need be, we will litigate on.
I have a daughter who come here, she was 2.5 years. Now she's allowed to work and so on, but I'm still a refugee, I'm not resident, so I'm still a refugee. She went to apply a job. Now this maroon ID we get, they tell her your paper is not recognized here. Now she grew up here like your brother, your sister. She grew up here, she don't know anything about where she come from. Imagine that young girl, how is she gonna pay when the paper given by Home Affairs? The company, they are not recognizing that paper. how she just I gonna end it. I'm ending it.
Okay, Jean-Claude, I'm going to do something that sometimes frustrates me, but it sounds like that's a very specific question related to an individual's experience. And so either of us or the organizations that we work for would be happy to assist. We would need to know more details, and this is perhaps not the right place to share all the individual details. So you can come, I know that I've seen you at Scalabrini before. You're welcome to bring that person to either of our organizations so that we can try to follow up and assist. But we would need to know the individual details, and let's respect that person's right to privacy about it as well in this forum.
It's individual, but it's my daughter. It's my daughter. It's individual, but it's happening to the many people. What I try to say is that all of us know this situation. We know what is going on here. You here, and you as a lawyer of refugees, you have to speak to Home Affairs Department to educate those company employee people, to tell them those paper we get from Home Affairs, how it works. That is what I try to say. Some people they are, and some company they accept, another they are not. Means something missing this.
I mean, that's the thing, a good take-home point for us. I mean, just for context, before I started working at the Refugee Law Unit many years ago, 2013, whenever it was, I had never seen an asylum seeker permit in my life. I had no idea who a refugee was. And what we do notice, or we see on a daily basis, that at least once a week get a call either from a university or a college or an employer or someone wanting to find out, we've got these permits, what are they? Can we employ people? Can they work? Can they open bank accounts? They've told us they're struggling to extend their permits. Can you clarify what the position is? There is a general lack of understanding amongst society in general, whether it's sometimes government departments themselves or even schools who say, no, it's not a permit, go get a work permit, go get a study permit. So people don't know. It might be that we need to intensify and strengthen our own advocacy efforts in trying to get more members of the public to understand who are these people, why are they here, and what permits are they on. It does take time, it does take resources, but it's something important that you've highlighted that we will do our best to focus on. Aiden, you look like you've got a question.
I believe if I heard you correctly before,
I'll just spare that now.
You were stating that people are born actually while they're going through this asylum process. People are born without birth certificates or identity cards, and you touched upon this idea that, like in South Africa, it's not just being born here which grants you citizenship. I'm not familiar with surrounding country citizenship laws, but I do know in some places you do need to be born there in order to. I mean, is the South African government effectively making people stateless through this policy?
So
I know that's quite
you can apply for citizenship if you are born here, and very broadly, if you're born here and have been here for, you can apply when you're 18. So you'd have to remain here for that long. There is a case about this because there were changes to the citizenship legislation, and the case is called Miriam Ali. And it was about Home Affairs, the way that Home Affairs interpreted the changes to the Citizenship Act. And they were saying that it would only apply to people who were born after the amendments, which would mean that people would be able to apply for citizenship after I think it was 2032, but I don't remember the exact year at this stage. That case was successfully litigated by the Legal Resources Center, and they got a good judgment in the Supreme Court of Appeal. And this was not last year, but the year before. I stand corrected on the exact date. But We have recently heard that Home Affairs once has applied for leave to appeal that case, but they're very much out of time. There's a set amount of days in which you can apply for leave to appeal, and they're a year out, more than a year. So it's something to watch. They've applied to the Constitutional Court for that, and there are implications for the way that they want to interpret the law or how they argue, but the courts have categorically said no, that is not the interpretation that is correct. So if applied and there is this disjuncture, then there is less of a risk of statelessness. But that's if applied. And I don't know if James wants to add, because I know UCT's been doing some work on this as well.
So technically, our laws provides that if a person would otherwise be stateless, then the state can grant citizenship. So there are safeguards, but as does happen, the practice sometimes is quite far from the reality. So that's also, but we're waiting on hopefully a refusal from the Constitutional Court in Miramari. I do have a question, if I may.
I just want to tie off Aidan's question around the birth certificate. I think Sally had mentioned it earlier. What's also important to note is that those handwritten birth certificates that are issued to foreigners or asylum seekers are terribly problematic. Any South African citizen or permanent resident who has a child here in South Africa will be issued with those birth certificates that are printed by a machine, and I think it's on a piece of paper this size. If you lose it, you can go to any Home Affairs because it's registered in the system and you can have it printed out. Those handwritten ones, if there's an error on it or if the father wasn't there, their details weren't captured on the birth certificate, you can never add them on. If you lose it, you have to go back to the exact same Home Affairs where you initially applied for it. Someone has to go look at the folio number if you still have it and go to a strong room somewhere and find the book, page through the books. So if you applied for it in 2008, it's going to be a mission for the person to go find, and they just never do it. They tell people to go away. So I have no idea why they created this parallel system where they just gave birth certificates that were handwritten to foreigners as opposed to just giving them birth certificates. And you will hear the line by Home Affairs in most of the media channels. They always say, oh, there's people here that are undocumented. They don't want to come forward. People do want to be documented because it makes no sense not to be documented. Without documents, you can't have access to rights. So people want to get documented, but they create all of these barriers and side parallel things that make no sense whatsoever. Because all you're doing is making more work for your own Home Affairs officials. If someone has to go look for this random document, just have it on the system like you do for South African citizens. It makes zero sense. Yes, James?
Just building on what Popo was saying as well, it affects at all levels because when you need to get a death certificate, if you have an expired or no permit, the same problems arise. You won't be issued with one, you can't bury. This is another problem that we've had, so it's at every level. My question is to both of you is just, we see that there's a disjunction between what the law says on the one hand and practice on the other hand. If you could isolate maybe 2 or 3 things that need to happen in terms of sort of practice and policy that will bring practice in line with the law, what would they be? Sorry to put you on the spot.
For me, if I just pick one, for me, the biggest challenge in our asylum system is with the quality of the adjudication process and the delays that come with it. So, in essence, what our refugee system is now, it's a lottery. Depending on which office you go to, which official you meet, whether you have the means to grease palms, you may or may not get refugee status. And part of the complaint of Home Affairs is, there's a whole bunch of economic migrants that are abusing the system. They're coming in through the system of the asylum system because you don't have to pay to get an asylum seeker permit. And with this lottery system, you can be on here for 12 years before Home Affairs actually interviews you and determines, actually, no, you're an economic migrant, right? If they adjudicated applications fairly, transparently, and those that deserved asylum got asylum within a relatively short period, then it wouldn't be this lottery where people take chances and try to get into the system. And you wouldn't have any of these problems where people are in the system for many, many, many years. So create a system that's clear, that's transparent, that's fair, and that's efficient. Then you will solve many of the problems that we have with the refugee system. It starts at that simple level of just having a proper quality adjudicative system.
So Well, I echo what Popo has said. I think the quality of the status determinations is atrocious. I would also look at, because that quality would apply if we were magically able to change that would apply to people coming into the system now, but we're still stuck with everyone who's already in the system. And so looking at backlogs, and we know that there is a process in place to look at the backlogs before the Refugee Appeal Board. There are also backlogs before the Standing Committee for Refugee Affairs. And so looking at potential group determinations, where that determination would be positive, and there'd probably be a way to isolate certain groups that can be positively determined in those backlogs. I think that would really assist with the backlogs at SCRA and at the RAB level. And then just implementing the law as it is would be incredible. It's a low bar. So yeah, that would be great. I would also say, and this links to what Popo said about the use of the system by people who don't fall within the convention grounds. We're not going to stop migration. We're not going to stop the movement of people in the SADC region and in South Africa. And I think that the sooner that the government realizes that and plans for it, the better. And I mean, South Africa was built on people who are on the move. And that's people who are on the move domestically, but also regionally. And so I would say that we need to look seriously at a regional SADC low-skill migrant visa. It's mentioned in the National Development Plan, one of the white papers, I think, and yet there's kind of no movement on it. But that would hopefully take a lot of the stress off the refugee system, because it would reroute a lot of people who might be using the system as an unofficial work permit system.
Thank you for the presentation. My first question is, what's the difference between the permit that is given to the asylum seeker and the certificate that is given to the refugee as a result of the recognition? I've listened to the differences, or will I say the similarities. I think the similarities are just the renewal. So you renew the permit, you also renew the certificate, right? And my second question is, can I call it hierarchy or status? So say, as a refugee, you're applying for scholarship, and most scholarship, the conditions are, okay, say 50% for South Africans and permanent resident holders, and maybe 25% to temporary resident holders. What is the status of refugees? So are they classified as permanent resident holders, sort of? I'm not sure if you understand. Thank you.
Okay. With a refugee certificate, it means that you have been recognized as someone who is in need of protection by the South African government. The asylum seeker permit means that you are still trying to get that recognition. So you are still seeking recognition. That's the difference just on that. And then there's the time periods. Someone who has a refugee certificate, so they're a recognized refugee, they have, on paper, they are entitled to all the same rights as a South African citizen, except the right to vote. So, for example, if a recognized refugee were to apply for a social grant, child support grant, old age grant, etc., as long as that refugee has a refugee ID, which they would have to apply for, they are entitled, they can apply for that grant. And the same tests would have to be done as are applied to South African citizens who apply for those grants. Asylum seekers are not allowed to apply for that grant. There's one grant that asylum seekers have been successful in applying for in very, very specific circumstances, and that was in 2008 during the xenophobic violence that happened, that asylum seekers were also able to access grants, or a specific grant. But for the rest, asylum seekers are on their own in terms of getting government assistance, whereas refugees on paper are entitled to more. One of the things that I didn't mention, but which we are seeing, is so refugee certificates are supposed to be renewed every 4 years. We're seeing that some of them are now starting to renew for only a period of 6 months. When that happens, the certificate holder cannot apply for a refugee ID. And as I said a few moments ago, you need a refugee ID in order to apply for a grant. So there's another barrier that I could stand here all day and give you barriers, but that's one that we're identifying. In terms of access to scholarships, I know that HCI Foundation specifically gives scholarships to refugees, but I agree with you that often, and I think maybe it's as a result of not understanding who a refugee is, many of the bursaries and scholarships available are not necessarily open to refugees. It's perhaps another area where more advocacy is needed from various refugee organizations, which is not the perfect answer to what you
What you need to look out for around tertiary education is that what we've been able to do quite successfully this year is lobby and advocate with a number of colleges and university institutions around leveraging the same rate that they do for South African citizens for refugees as well. Because in some institutions what used to happen is that refugees used to be charged international rates and had to pay fees up front, which just didn't make any sense, because in essence what happens when you become a refugee is that host country envelops you with its protection and the benefits that come with it. So it makes no sense for them to charge you as an international student. So we get a lot of these requests and questions from admin and HR from various places. They ask, should they be charged as international students? And the answer that we always give them is no. So if you can't get a bursary, at the very least, they need to charge you local rates.
Just to follow up, I think also, can you talk about when do they go from refugee to permanent resident? Because once you get permanent residence, after a couple of years, you're entitled to at least, in theory, apply for citizenship.
Once you've been a refugee once you've been recognized as a refugee and received that certificate, once you've been that for 5 years, you are entitled to apply to the Standing Committee for Refugee Affairs for certification in terms of Section 27C of the Refugees Act. Our shorthand for it is Section 27C certification. And what that means is you are asking the Standing Committee to recognize that you will remain a refugee indefinitely. The Standing Committee doesn't only have backlogs for reviews. It also has backlogs for Section 27C certification applications. And so I started interning first at UCT Refugee Rights Unit when I was a student here. I then went on to work at Legal Resources Center, and now I'm at Scalabrini. And in that time, I would say that the number of certifications that I have seen from SCRA is less than 20. So I don't see, or I haven't seen a lot of those, and that's been since kind of 2012, 2013. Perhaps Popo may have seen more.
I mean, they've gotten better over the years. You used to make an application for certification, which maybe if we take a step back, that whole process to me
is absurd.
It does seem a bit absurd. So you want the Standing Committee to look at the reasons that brought you here and decide and look into a magic ball and say, it looks like you're kind of going to be a refugee forever. What they consider, what they look at, what even indefinitely as a time period kind of looks like for them. Are they looking maybe the next 2 years, next 3 years? It makes no sense. We made the applications, some of them are successful, but it's really a toss-up as to what they really consider as someone who's going to be in a situation of refugeeism for an indefinite period. But what that also does, it just makes more work for themselves. Why not just say, if you've been here and you've been a refugee for 5 or 6 or 7 years, after that 7-year period, you automatically qualify to become a permanent resident. Why must you then come back to us and apply and us process this whole new application? It makes zero sense. If you've been here for 6, 7 years, you should be given permanent residence. I mean, what prospects would you possibly have of going back to your home country and rebuilding a life after you spend so much time here and you have roots here, you've married here, you've got children here? And I do understand the international principle around refugee protection is that it's meant to be temporary. But the real world practical realities is that people don't just sit around for 7 years and do nothing. They continue on with their lives. And you've got to find a way in terms of what the 1951 Convention says is that you've got to allow people to naturalize. They've got to move away from the state of limbo. You don't know when your permit is going to be taken away. You don't know if you're ever going to be extended. So you've got to get people out of this psychological limbo that they suffer from and let them naturalize. So yes, you can go from an asylum seeker to a refugee to a permanent resident, and if you then hold that permanent residence for 5 or 10 years, you can then become a citizen. But
you have to, again, I mean, once you get the 27C certification, you have to apply for permanent residence.
Yeah.
Once you're granted that, then you would have to apply for naturalization. And just to say, if you are on any other visa regime, let's say you're here on a work permit and you're here for the set amount of time, and again, I think it's 5 years, you can apply for permanent residence. So the parallel system under the Immigration Act is very unequal to what recognized refugees face after recognition. I'm not even talking about the years that they are here prior to being recognized. I heard an interesting term recently, which was asylum seeker refugee, which was used to describe the people in South Africa because of the prolonged status determination process that people are subjected to.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to both of you for your presentation. I just have a question and perhaps maybe just an observation from the numerous examples that you have mentioned and from the two gentlemen in front, is that there seems to be a disconnect between the law and what the government does in practice, and particularly it seems that also it's a very deliberate thing. It's not it's not by accident. So my question is, what is the reason behind that? Is the government undecided on their policy on migrations and what to do with immigrants and refugees, and so are they trying to cover it up by saying, oh no, we'll pass a law where it will seemingly look like we're protecting refugees, but in practice we'll try and frustrate them and keep them in the state for whatever reasons that they have? And what is the conversation happening around that? This particular conversation. Okay, I understand.
I mean, for me, and the views I reflect don't reflect the views of the UCT Refugee Clinic. They're my own personal views. In essence, this is the stance. From what I've been able to look by looking through parliamentary questions that are posed to the Minister of Home Affairs in Parliament, looking through policy documents, white papers and green papers on this, in a very crude and crass way, the South African government, if they could, would say, we don't want foreigners here, we don't want refugees here, but they just can't. The manner in which they treat immigrants in general leads any rational person to that conclusion, that you are not welcome here, right? And Sally touched on it when she said, we've got to start looking at migration differently. People who are foreigners, I don't think there's any person who's a foreigner on this planet, but people who are here, not born in South Africa, should not be seen or viewed by the state as a threat. And that thinking and that discourse is now starting to influence the manner in which we approach migration. Because if you look at the white papers and green papers, they talk about this whole secularization approach, that we need to be stiffer on our borders, militarize our borders. And there's no empirical data at all to support that policy stance that we're being overrun by migrants. The other one is, they're putting a burden on our socio-economic systems, our social basic services. No data is there to support that. So the powers that be that sit up there and make the policies clearly are on a mission to make South Africa a bureaucratic and administrative nightmare, such that people don't want to apply for immigration permits, and those that have applied for asylum seeker permits just merely give up and go away. It makes zero sense, because Sally correctly pointed out, people have been migrating for years. People are going to come to South Africa. If people are faced with an option of, do I brave the Al-Shabaab in Somalia, or do I stay in Cameroon now when they're on the brink of a civil war between the North and the South because the South wants to secede, or do I stay in the eastern parts of DRC where I'm at risk of either being forcibly conscripted? If you're a woman, it is the rape capital of the world. Do I stay there, or do I come to South Africa and live here undocumented? Any rational person is going to come here. If you don't give me a permit, I'm going to stay here either way, because it's a life and death situation. Where I'm fleeing is much more dangerous and worse. So they're thinking, let's make it hard, they're going to go away. People are not going to go away. Rather, document people so you know who's here and give them access to be able to work, because I will repeat this. Migrants don't come here on their knees and do this. They make a plan, like the gentleman said. They live, they work, they start businesses, they employ people. They are very resilient people, like Sally had said. I don't know where this whole thing of let's make it difficult for them, maybe they'll go away, comes from. It's misguided and is not influenced in any way by law.
I'm not stopping you. I have a question. Do you think it's any different than the way that the South African government treats vulnerable people in general, though? So, I work in violence against women, right? And the story that you're telling about papers and handwritten things and books in the back of rooms is verbatim what happens in the domestic violence protection order system, right? So we make it as hard as possible for people to get protection from the state. I agree with you that I think migrants are reserved for a special kind of hostility from the South African government. But I think there's something we need to think about the way in which our state provides services, or doesn't feel accountable. Because in the same way, the Domestic Violence Act, the Sexual Offences Act, the police send you from there to there, the court sends you from there to there, no one serves your order, the paper, there's no photocopier toner, or, the police van only has 3 wheels. I think we need to think a bit more. I'm not even joking. I think there's a bigger question here sometimes. I think as advocates in our spaces, we get so familiar with the problems that we're trying to press against that I think we sometimes forget to step back and say there's a commonality here, and that there's maybe something at a bigger level. I don't know, something I'm really thinking about in my early work.
But sometimes I think it depends from cause to cause, but I'm going to try to say this without putting my foot in my mouth. But if I'm frank, refugees and their issues isn't a sexy topic that the media writes as often as they should about when they're violations of their human rights. They will write long they'll write long articles on if they bust 4 Nigerians who've been selling drugs somewhere, right? They'll write those they love, but they won't write long, lengthy articles around what's been happening in the Cape Town Refugee Reception Office. So in order to get people riled up and pissed off about refugee issues is difficult, and I was hoping that this movement around getting people really angry and pissed off around domestic violence against women was going to gain momentum, but it's kind of fizzled out. But how do we get people to realize that the government is the government, but we have the power and they're accountable to us, and we need to be more pissed off about what they do in not just as a social media fad, but to do it over a prolonged and sustained way in order for them to realize, actually, if we don't perform here, we're not going to go anywhere. And part of the challenge is that I think South African citizens are performance inelastic. So no matter how much our government abuses us, we always vote for them. And there's no incentive for them to take our demands seriously because they know they're in. And that democratic system then is broken if it's like that. If there is no accountability. Your accountability can't be every 4 years. Your accountability has to be every single day, every single hour your government must serve you. But I do take the point around seeing how do we galvanize our different causes, in a way to amplify our voices and see the commonalities in the barriers. It's a very good take-home question.
I can respond to that it's kind of like it's like yelling into a vacuum. So eventually you're going to yell, you're going to be mad, you're going to be scared, frustrated. But if you're yelling into a vacuum and no one is listening to you, that anger is going to manifest in, like, it's just going to fester in yourself, or it's going to, like, internalize it, and you're going to, like, it's going to psychologically mess you up, speaking from experience. But you see it in all of the structures. Even in this structure is Kramer. You can complain, you can be angry, you can be so angry, you can be on the brink of, pretty much anything. And if your grievances or whatever it is, your experience is dismissed, you're just going to be angry and you're going to end up broken. So I think as much as I'm like pro getting everyone angry and pumped, I don't know if it's even that helpful, because like with the gender-based thing, people make posters like, less toxic masculinity, more toxic by Britney Spears. Like, that's not helpful. She was very angry, I'm sure, but like, guys, revolution.
So I think, just on Kelly's point, I think that one of the things that is necessary is to perhaps look at how we're working in silos. I think that it's easy to talk about the interconnectedness of struggles, but yeah, looking at how we work in silos, looking at the interconnectedness of struggles, and also looking at who we target our anger or actions toward. And if I got angry at the ground level official at the refugee office, it's not going to achieve systemic change. In fact, that ground level official has probably seen 120 people on that day and is tired and probably has to go home and look after their children or whatever. And so I think that finding a strategy to target the right people, not just in terms of who we vote for, but also just in terms of accountability is really important. And I don't have all the answers, but I think that part of the pathway to finding those answers is not working in silos, figuring out strategies for targeting the right people. Now we've got 1, 2, 3.
I was thinking more just back on the freedom of movement idea. I think I missed it maybe when you were clarifying the distinctions, but I just wanted a little bit of clarity on what an economic migrant is. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is just, to me, like, there's a unifying thing if we can, it's potential, okay, as you try to like create a solution, like that's what I'm quite solution oriented as a person, otherwise I get quite frustrated. And try to like visualize what it might look like, right? What the ideal would be, and then work backwards from there, like what steps need to be taken. So I think about maybe the EU as an example, and historically, if you're linked and tied to other states, and freedom of movement is imperative, then conflicts tend to like maybe be more difficult. I don't know how that would work in a Pan-African context, but like that's kind of what I was thinking about. Like there are talks about maybe creating a free trade and a free work environment across the continent. And do we see that as something that Africa is ready for, South Africa is ready for? Like, yeah, that's something that
Well, we were supposed to have an African passport by the end of 2018. We still don't have one.
You don't have one? I have one.
Part of the fear around creating an economic hub in the SADC region, ECOWAS does it do it very well. If you live within the ECOWAS region, you can move and work easily. South Africa, I believe, when I've been in Parliament and we presented on this particular issue, believes if they create that kind of hub in SADC, everyone's just going to come here. Because then, what other options do migrants have? Do they go to Bots, which is really tiny. There's more people in Soweto than there are in Botswana. Do they go to Zimbabwe? No, because the economic situation and the political tension there is quite terrible. Do they go to Malawi? Malawi has an incredibly stressful economic time as well. They just think if you allow people to move freely within the SADC region, everyone then is just going to come here and it's going to be a burden on us. So I think we're a long well away from having a regional free movement framework that actually works in the SADC region. I am a proponent of free movement, but how it works in reality, where there are differing economic climates in the region, is problematic, and it's something we need to think, I think, quite clearly about. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. I can't take it any further than that.
Just to answer, economic migrant, I prefer just to use the term migrant, but economic migrant is a term that is often used in the media and by government, and it's someone who moves for economic purposes. So they're moving across a border often, but it can also be internally for a job, for example. Yeah, I think it's probably easier and more useful to simply use the term migrant as distinguished from, for example, refugee and asylum seeker. But, I mean, an asylum seeker and a refugee, they're both also people on the move. They just have specific protections that international law, regional and domestic law afford to them as well.
No, it was just two comments, but I think it was also coming back to the work in silos. Like if we look at health and mobility, because I work more on health. Yeah, we have the focus for migrants, but if we really look at the South African healthcare system, then we also see that there's a lot of barriers in terms of internal mobility and getting access to care. So we have to be careful when we advocate, for instance, for removing the barriers for international migrants, that we're conscious of that reality that is. And I think it's being conscious about it, and the way how you then advocate, like taking those messages along rather than alienating maybe some part of the population. And then it was more on accountability and is it deliberate? I think yes. Probably part of it is deliberate and to frustrate people, and that there's policies who are deliberately making it difficult for people. On the other hand, I think as well, and I had heard that when the law was created, that actually there was not the institutions to implement the law were not created in the sense or given the capacity and the training. And I think today we still see a lot of that as well. That it's not only the politicians who have probably their agenda, but I think there's also a problem with the institutional capacity and accountability of those institutions, which is also very harmful. So,
I think we're wrapping up, right? My parting comment to help close this discussion is that we could fix all of these problems, but ultimately what I want to see, I want to work myself out of a job, right? I don't ever want to have refugees, right? So it's all good and well to have a refugee system that maybe one day will work, but if we do not take a hard look at the reasons that cause people to flee, then we're never ever going to be able to do our job. We don't want people, no one ever wants to leave their homes. So we've got to, as we lobby for change in this system, but we've got to also lobby our politicians to take a more stern approach in their diplomacy, in ensuring that dictatorships don't run for 40, 50 years, right? To ensure that there are enough peacekeeping missions to ensure that people don't have to flee their homes from war and persecution. So we've got to deal with, yes, when people are refugees, look after them, but we've got to ensure that they don't get pushed out of their homes to begin with. And that's the only way that we're ever really going to resolve this refugee crisis that we're having.
I think my parting point would just be that migrants, refugees and asylum seekers are a net positive for the South African society, and not just South Africa but regionally as well. I've started being interested in the impact that remittances have in a region, and if we ensure that people have access to their socioeconomic rights here, whether you're whichever status you're on, if money is being sent home, money is also being spent here. But that money that's being sent home helps to stabilize things there as well, which then feeds into what Popo just said about how we need to be outward looking in terms of our policy positions and stabilizing regions, so that we address the root causes of, at the very least, why people become refugees. Thank you very much.
A quick word of thanks from me to both Sally and Popo. As always, a wonderful talk that could have probably more appropriately gone on all afternoon. Thank you to all of you for coming, and my parting shot is like and follow us on Instagram, which is I hear what all of the kids today are doing, and Facebook for all of the older people like me. That's where you'll hear about our next events, one of which is the Can You Unspeak Lawyer Advice Assembly for next week, which is in the moot court, right? So we've got colleagues from Ndifuna Kwazi coming to talk to us about how we talk to communities about legal terms, terminology, processes, advice, and it's sure to be a crackerjack event. So please RSVP, because otherwise, the lunch police don't want to give you lunch. But we hope to see you next week. Thank you.